Welcome to Climate Quickies, bite-sized nuggets of climate goodness from our TEDxLondon experts in under 10 minutes.
With COP30 over, it's time to take stock. Was it a big disappointment? Were there any wins to celebrate? And what now? We caught up with past guests who were there to find out. First, from the Pacific Islands, we have TED speaker, film director and founder of Pacific Climate Warriors and Beyond the Narrative, Fenton Lutunatabua.
Bulvanaka, my name is Fenton Lutunatabua and I'm from the Fiji Islands and I work with an organization called 350.org. The outcome at the COP30 wasn't necessarily everything that we had hoped for or wanted, but I do want to recognize and acknowledge that it is a step forward. However, what we need right now is not just a step forward, but actually a giant leap in implementation if we're going to beat the worst of the climate crisis. With the just transition mechanism, we're seeing progress, but without a plan to phase out coal, oil, and gas, we're truly stagnating at a time when our islands can't afford even a small amount of delay. I know our Pacific leaders and negotiators fought hard for climate justice and the pathway to renewable energy, and we're going to keep fighting to get the finance we need in order to make all of that possible. Above all, the fight to keep fossil fuels in the ground continues because this closing window on 1.5 degrees Celsius means we're walking a fine line between survival and climate catastrophe. In terms of what's next after COP30 for 2026, the important work must continue after COP. We will hold leaders accountable to what they agreed upon there and push for higher ambition on things that they failed to achieve. The COP30 president mentioned a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels that will continue outside the COP processes, and we can't let that just be empty promises. Our closest fossil fuel producing neighbor, Australia, came to COP30 hoping to secure a presidency over COP31. Even though they weren't successful and won't be hosting next year's climate talks, we maintain our pressure on them to rise to climate leadership and address their fossil fuel exports, and particularly the expansion of their oil and gas extraction. Here in the Pacific, with the Pacific Climate Warriors and 350.org, we will continue to keep organizing amongst our people, especially our young people, in order to dismantle the fossil fuel industry, but also enable the dream of affordable and renewable energy in the Pacific.
Next, a climate philanthropy advisor at Impatience Earth, as she landed feet first sharing her experience at the conference, here's Raysa França.
Hi, I'm Raysa França, and I'm a climate philanthropy advisor at Impatience Earth. I'm recording this with my feet in the Tapajós River in Pará, the state that hosted COP30. So you will hear some noises of joy and energy coming from the river. I want to share two aspects that made progress possible at COP30. The first one, the just transition mechanism, which was such a huge win, and I want to highlight here the magic that made it happen. It was built by the power of people, youth, indigenous leaders, workers, campaigners, organizations that were organizing for this to happen long before COP even began. And philanthropy, aka donated money, also helped sustain this kind of work and made COP30 more inclusive. Second, care as infrastructure. We tend to picture climate protection as dams, roads, flood infrastructure, but care is also important in keeping communities resilient. In Belém, I saw and experienced this in small acts of kindness. Belém locals were checking in, they were giving directions, they were sharing tips, with someone even giving me their own umbrella when it was raining cats and dogs. It protected all my equipment. This care is part of climate resilience and it deserves recognition and support. If you take one thing from COP30, let it be people power.
Now we have a human rights and environmental lawyer, activist, author, and executive director of the Tenure Facility on how Indigenous communities are holding the line. Nonette Royo.
Hello, this is Nonette Royo, Executive Director of the Tenure Facility. Now that this COP has come to an end, we want to emphasize that tenure rights is climate action, and Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant peoples, and local communities have shown they can do it. Brazilian government, in response, marked the biggest progress in Indigenous land demarcation in the last 20 years. More than 7 million hectares. In terms of finance, more than 35 funders committed 1.8 billion over the next 5 years to strengthen land tenure and forest rights. 15 countries signed the commitment and pledging to recognize and protect 160 million hectares of indigenous and local community lands. As we witness at this summit, the movement is very strong. Although leaders sadly could not agree on key issues, communities on the ground continue to remain persistent.
Let's hear from South African climate activist Kumi Naidoo as he shares the importance of building pressure through grassroots movements.
Hi friends, I'm Kumi Naidoo, a South African human rights and environmental justice activist, currently serving as president of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative. My first reaction to the COP30 outcome. Well, you know the old saying, COP sets the floor, not the ceiling. And this year the floor was wobbling like an old shack in a storm. We saw some encouraging words about phasing out fossil fuels, but words don't cut carbon. As my grandmother used to say, you can't cook with promises. Still, we must hold two truths together. The negotiations didn't deliver what science and justice demand. And across the corridors, people, especially from the global south, showed courage, clarity, and determination. They reminded us that real leadership often comes from those with the least power on paper, but the most at stake in reality. So what's next as we look to 2026? We cannot wait for governments to find their spines. We build pressure from below, through movements, through art and culture, through solidarity that crosses borders. And we keep pushing for a fast, fair, and funded transition away from fossil fuels. Because our children won't ask what text was adopted at COP30. They'll ask what we did when the future was on the line.
Next up is chair of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative about an exciting new coalition to drive change, Tzeporah Berman.
Hi, my name's Tzeporah Berman, and I'm the chair of the Fossil Fuel Treaty. A shocking thing happened in Belém at COP30. How countries can create a roadmap for fossil fuel phase-out was the predominant conversation. Yet when the final text was gabbled through, the words fossil fuels had been ripped right out of the text. We cannot afford to wait another year for another weak political signal while communities burn and drown. But there's hope. The COP presidency formally acknowledged the diplomatic conference on fossil fuel phase-out announced by Colombia and the Netherlands for next year. And then dozens of countries pledged their support. And now there's an exciting coalition of the willing forming to tackle these issues head on, to help meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, including by discussing pathways for a fossil fuel treaty. So now, all eyes turn to Santa Marta in April for this historic gathering. And maybe, just maybe, this parallel process that's not subject to the same rules of consensus and fossil fuel lobby influence, maybe it can create a bold new pathway to protect what we love.
Now we have the director of the Satat Sampara Climate Foundation on how, despite the disappointment, some countries are emerging as a ray of hope and inspiration to others. Here's Harjeet Singh.
I'm Harjeet Singh, Founding Director for the Sampara Climate Foundation and Strategic Advisor to the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. I'm just back from COP30 in Belém, which was touted as the COP of implementation and COP of truth. The fact is, we are really far from the scale and speed of implementation required to respond to the climate crisis just because there is simply no adequate money on the table. And the truth is, we saw over 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists working to protect their interests so that they can continue to extract and burn oil, gas, and coal. However, people's power forced governments to develop a new just transition mechanism so that communities and workers can get support as we move toward clean and renewable energy. While the COP failed to include the words fossil fuels in the final agreement, Colombia emerged as a ray of hope. They mobilized over 90 countries, including the UK, to release a declaration on transitioning away from fossil fuels. And in partnership with the Netherlands, they will organize an international conference on this transition in April next year. This momentum forced the COP president to announce that he will work on a roadmap to transition away from fossil fuels, drawing lessons from the upcoming conference. This is a huge boost to the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative, which has been advocating for a new global framework to phase out fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner. And I'm really looking forward to attending the conference and helping shape the way forward.
And finally, why, much like a boat race, all nations must row together to bend the curve on climate change. Here's founder and executive director of Canopy, Nicole Rycroft.
Hi, curious folks. I'm Nicole Rycroft. I'm the founder and executive director of Canopy. I've been on the ground at COP in Belém. Whew, what a different feeling there has been in Brazil to previous COPs. And so there's two main truths that COP has left me with that I'd like to share. One is around some of those moments that move so painfully slowly. Bureaucratic rules, slow negotiations, lobbyists who are just there to be obstructionist, progress that inches forward when the world needs it to move in leaps and bounds. And it feels especially heavy being here in the Amazon, where we're surrounded by the urgency of timely action, where irreplaceable forests and cultures will be lost if we don't get this right in the right timeline. And then contrasting that, we have these other moments where you feel like you've wandered into the most fantastic, weirdly bureaucratic escape rooms that are full of wonderful people who you've never met from different cultures and languages and politics who are all bent over working together to achieve the seemingly impossible. Working like they've trained for this moment their entire lives. It can be messy, but it's also beautiful in its choreography, and it's the closest thing that we have to a global teamwork. And as a former competitive rower, I really appreciate teamwork, right? COP reminds me of both the worst and the best days on the water. You know, there are some days where races, you feel like you are arm wrestling the boat the entire way down the course. You're fighting the boat, you're fighting the wind, your lungs, your legs hurt, and it's exhausting. And then other times, it is pure magic. Everybody hits the same rhythm. You fly along. It's like you're kind of like gliding across the top of the water faster than you thought was possible. And it doesn't necessarily hurt any less, but the outcome makes it sweet. And COP has that same potential. The strain, the focus juxtaposed with execution, and the magic that can happen when your crew swing along in sync. And so what matters now, as we're wrapping up COP and emerging into the next stages, is keeping the rhythm. Forests need real protection. Finance needs to reach frontline communities. Corporate buyers need to scale climate resilient solutions. Governments need to back their climate commitments with action. Because when we find that rhythm, momentum builds faster than ever imaginable. And coming out of this COP, I'm genuinely excited about us bending the curve on climate.
Thanks for listening to this quickie.
This episode was created by our superstar podcast team at TEDxLondon. Until next time,
Stay curious.